wanted to talk about how term limits turn legislatures over to lobbyists. We've had, for the second time in public last week, you had Mitch McConnell freeze up for 30 seconds. This is apparently the consequences of the combination of having fallen and gotten a concussion and being 81 years old. And it's leading a lot of people to have a conversation. I mean, the number of boomers in Congress is way out of proportion to the number of boomers in the population, number one. Although I don't think that's unusual. I think the oldest generation, because it takes, a career to, generally speaking, for people to work their way up to the House and particularly the Senate. But nonetheless, you've got, a number of really elderly people. And let's also be clear, elderly is a highly subjective thing. Bernie Sanders is the exact same age as Mitch McConnell, but Bernie Sanders right now is traveling around the country promoting progressive values and promoting good legislation. And I mean, he's the Energizer Bunny. Mitch McConnell is just kind of shuffling along and freezing. But in any case, this whole thing is leading to a conversation about what do we do about old people in Congress. Dianne Feinstein is another one that's provoking that conversation. And the solution that the Republican Party has, and they're, the right-wing talk show hosts and the GOP are just pushing this really, really hard, is term limits. They're saying, well, we need to cut, we need to limit people to 6 years, or at the most 12 years. We have 28 states that have term limits. They were all Republican controlled at the time that they put term limits into place. And we now know, I mean, this is an experiment that's been going on for about 20 years, and we now know what happens when you put into place term limits. The theory, the sales pitch is, you get new blood and renewed vitality and all that kind of stuff. In reality, something quite different happens, which, by the way, is what Republicans want. In reality, what happens is that you strengthen the hand of the lobbyists and you discourage good people who are not rich from going into politics, and thus open the door, encourage rich people who might not be so interested in the public good to run for politics, to join, to become a member of public office. So how does that work? Well, here's how it happens. Typically, when a new person comes into Congress, and this is, state legislatures, federal House of Representatives, U.S. Senate, whatever it may be, typically when a new person comes in, they find somebody who's been around for a while, ideally 10, 20 years, somebody who has the institutional memory of the institution, who knows how things get done, who knows where the bodies are buried, metaphorically, who understands how legislation gets made, who knows where the bathrooms are, and where the escape hatch is if the place gets raided by right-wingers again, all this kind of stuff. Well, what happens with term limits is that institutional memory is lost. The old-timers are gone. But the institutional memory actually lives on, sort of, because no Republican ever, anywhere, has ever suggested that lobbyists should be term limited. So here you've got in every legislature in the United States right now, and this has really exploded since 2010, when 5 Republicans, corrupt Republicans on the U.S. Supreme Court in their Citizens United ruling fully legalized political bribery. And the consequence of that is that every single legislature in America has more lobbyists than it has legislators, including Congress. There's over 35,000 lobbyists in Washington, D.C. It's only, 535 legislators. So the bottom line here is that this enormous, so when new people come into Congress, they go to lobbyists to find out where the bodies are buried. And of course, the lobbyists are going to put their own particular spin on things. This is how, it does more harm than good. Now, where did this fad start? This whole term limits fad? Because there was, through most of the 20th century, there was no discussion of term limits. There was no sense of a need for term limits. But this all began in 1990. George Herbert Walker Bush, Pappy Bush also, was the president, and he was very unpopular. the Reagan recession, there had been 2 recessions as a result of Reagan's tax cuts. The war on organized labor was really starting to take a bite. We had not yet signed NAFTA. At that time, George Herbert Walker Bush was finishing the negotiations of it, which had started during the Reagan administration. But nonetheless, companies were already starting to offshore their products. Monopolies were forming all across the United States because in 1983, Reagan had basically ended the enforcement of our anti-monopoly laws. So here you had Poppy Bush, who was very unpopular, and he was looking for an issue that he could ride to victory in the 1992 election against Bill Clinton. At the time, he didn't know it would be Bill Clinton, but that's how it worked out. And so on December 12th, 1990, a year and a month before the 1992 election, he rolled out through his chief of staff, John Sununu, term limits. This is from the New York Times. This is December 12, 1990, New York Times. President Bush has decided to push for a constitutional amendment to limit the number of terms for members of Congress, his chief of staff, John H. Sununu, said today. Doing so as he prepares for his re-election campaign will put Mr. Bush squarely and publicly on the side of an idea that is widely popular among voters and is wildly unpopular among members of Congress. Even though such passage of an amendment is unlikely, there's little risk for Mr. Bush in associating himself with this movement. Politically, the move fits nicely with a growing effort by the White House to depict Congress as the source of most of the nation's problems. See, things were not going well as a result of the Reagan Revolution. And Congress was pointing the finger at the White House, and Bush wanted to point the finger at Congress. So his whole term limits thing was really a scam. He never intended for it to pass. He didn't even, it was not even a serious effort. It was a campaign effort. But then Rush Limbaugh, whose show had started 2 years earlier in 1988, Rush Limbaugh picked this thing up and ran with it really hard for decades. And the whole right-wingosphere picked it up as well because, as I said, it helps Republicans. It strengthens the lobbyists and weakens the legislatures, which is why every single time Republicans get control of a red state, they institute term limits. So far, we've got term limits now in Oklahoma. They got them in 1990 as a result of Bush's lobbying. And then all of these other states got them in 1992, which was the election year. Maine, California, Colorado, Arkansas, Michigan, Florida, Ohio, South Dakota, Montana, Arizona, and Missouri. Nevada and Louisiana put them into place in 1995 and 96, respectively, and Nebraska in 2000. North Dakota finally got around to it in 2022. And in every single case, it has hurt the legislatures. This 25 years later, this is the Citizens Research Council of Michigan in 2018 published a report titled 25 Years Later, Term Limits Have Failed to Deliver on Their Promise. And they note legislative term limits in Michigan have failed to achieve their proponents' stated goals, ridding government of career politicians, increasing diversity among elected officials, and making elections more competitive. Term limits have instead made state legislators, especially House members, view their time as a stepping stone to another office. Term limits have failed to strengthen ties between legislatures and their districts or sever cozy relationships with lobbyists. They have weakened the legislature in its relation with the executive branch. There was a similar study about Florida. Bottom line, the other thing that I didn't mention that term limits do is they cause legislators, first of all, anybody who can't afford to lose their job after 6 years doesn't go in the first place. So only rich people go in, or people who are, fairly okay. But then they spend those 6 years sucking up to particular companies or industries in the hope that those companies or industries will then hire them when they get out of office. And so it even makes corruption worse. Now, are any of these Republican states going to undo their term limits? Probably not. But Republicans in every state in the union are pushing for term limits, including the states controlled by Democrats. Keep an eye on this. Term limits are poison.